Welcome back to the class. And in this class, we are going to discuss a very interesting argument by Ulrich Beck, a German sociologist, on his idea of rooted cosmopolitanism. And this is the final class in our 2-week long discussions on cultural globalization. So I hope you remember all the previous classes. We started a discussion on the notions of culture and then globalization. We discussed about clash of civilization. We discussed about a number of other interesting topics, and we spent a lot of time with Arjuna Padure, and we discussed McDonaldization. And I thought we will end this discussion on cultural globalization with a very important and impressive argument by Ulrich Beck on this whole idea of cosmopolitanism, and he qualifies it by calling it as rooted cosmopolitanism. And this argument it follows from a much larger arguments about whether the whole world is witnessing a homogenization, is a kind of American invasion is taking place across the globe. Something a host of discussions and debates that were created in the background of George Ritz's theory of McDonaldization. Okay, there were a lot of scholars who argued that there is a kind of a new cultural imperialism from the America is taking place, and American cultural consumption patterns, cultural ideas, and a host of other things are spreading across the globe. So in that background, Ulrich Beck has written this, and I would go with his original essay, an essay published by written by Ulrich Beck. It is from this book, Global America, The Cultural Consequences of Globalization, by Ulrich Beck, Nathan Sneijder, and Reinhard Winter. And as from the title, you can see that it shows McDonald's in China. And so this is the first chapter that we are going to discuss in this work. So if anybody is interested in understanding the debates around the question of Americanization, American influence on globalization, this book would be of immense use. So let us get started with that. Now, Ulrich Beck, he straightaway wants to say what exactly he intends to do in this particular paper or particular chapter. In this chapter, I would like to clarify some conceptual oppositions. My claim is that the concept of Americanization based on a national understanding of globalization. The concept of cosmopolitanization, by contrast, is an explicit attempt to overcome the methodological nationalism and produces concepts capable of reflecting a newly transnational world. Things are made even more complicated in the fact that it is very difficult to draw a clear-cut line between concepts, which is what makes the theme of this book so tricky and exciting. So he argues, he's critical of this whole idea of Americanization because we know that we discussed Appadure, and then things are not as simple as what is presented in the larger argument of Americanization. Beck argues that this Americanization is based on a national understanding of globalization, and he goes on elaborating what does this national understanding, what is international understanding of globalization, what is transnational understanding of globalization. So they're all very, very important theoretical arguments. The concept of cosmopolitanization, by contrast, is an explicit attempt to overcome this methodological nationalism. So what does methodological nationalism mean? We will come back to this discussion again later when we discuss Ulrich Beck. He makes a very fervent call for social scientists, especially sociologists, to move beyond methodological nationalism. And he argues that methodological nationalism is the methodological orientations of social sciences to look at their subject matter as something that is bounded within the boundaries of nation state. For example, conventionally when you talk about Indian society, you think that Indian society is something that is delimited within the boundaries of Indian nation state. So it's the case with Indian polity or Indian economy. Okay, so he says that this particular framework, as that the nation state is the container of the economic or political or social activity. It's a very modernist understanding where the nation state is seen as the natural containers or boundaries of human activity. And this, he argues, is becoming outdated fast, especially after the process of globalization became more intense, and what we require is a methodological cosmopolitanism. Okay, methodological cosmopolitanism, where we look at the societies in India or in any other country for that matter as being influenced by cross-national currents and transnational flows and influences and other stuff. We will come back to that more in detail. So from the national perspective, cosmopolitan or cosmopolitanism is viewed pejoratively as an enemy image. Cosmopolitan refers to a global player, the imperial capitalist or the middle class intellectual without local roots, and such is a loaded concept. You know, this term cosmopolitan is not always a very positive thing, because cosmopolitan is seen as people don't have any claim to any particular territory, they don't have any roots, they are seen as the enemies of nationalism, whereas nationalists are seen as the sons of the soil. They have a kind of increased attachment to their own place of birth, whereas cosmopolitans don't have that kind of a loyalty. So he's trying to strike a balance between that. So since the late 1990s, there has been a sharp increase in the literature that attempts to relate discourses on globalization in the cultural and political terms to redefinition of cosmopolitanism for the global age. And then he goes on for a lengthy analysis about the emergence of this term cosmopolitan. But it's very interesting to see that, because it emerges from two terms. One is two communities. One is cosmos, that is nature, and the polis, namely the city or state. To be more precise, every individual is rooted in one cosmos, that is, naturally we are all human beings, belong to a particular part of the nature, but simultaneously in different cities, different territories, ethnicities, hierarchies, nations, religions, and so on. So cosmopolitanism from the very beginning indicates this kind of a tension between something that is very common and something that is very unique and distinct. Thus, cosmopolitanism generates a logic of non-exclusive opposition, making patriots of the two worlds that are simultaneously equal and different. What makes cosmopolitanism so interesting for social science, social theory of second modern societies is its thinking and living in terms of inclusive oppositions. So, what makes cosmopolitanism is so interesting for social theory for the second modern society is that this and living in terms of inclusive oppositions, nature is associated with society, yet the object is part of subjectivity, otherness of the other is included in one's own self-identity and self-definition, and the logic of exclusion, exclusive opposition is rejected. So he says that in the first modernity, these things were present, the nature and the culture, the nature and the society, the nature and the group in which you belong. All these things were presented as opposites, as mutually exclusive opposites, but that is not the case in the second modernity. Second modernity is the rough time frame that these scholars attribute to, say, post-1980s or post-1970s period, the same period that many other scholars characterize as postmodern. And I mentioned in the previous class, or I am going to explain it in the coming week, that scholars including Ulrich Beck and a host of other sociologists don't agree to this concept called as a postmodernity. Rather, they would call it as late modern or reflexive modern or high modern, because they argue that this concept of modernity cannot be completely thrown away. So Kant defines cosmopolitanism as a way of becoming universal and the particular, nation and the Wultberger, nation and the world citizenship. As regards the concept of globality, Roland Robertson and Albro, cosmopolitanism signifies rooted cosmopolitanism, having roots and wings at the same time. And this is something very interesting, because once you have the roots alone, then you are restricted to a particular given place and time. And if you have only wings alone, then you fly all the time. So here they are talking about a possibility, a seemingly impossible possibility of having roots and wings at the same time. This social science, methodological cosmopolitanism is opposed to methodological nationalism. That is, it rejects state-centric perspectives and sociological lack of imagination. Okay, that's what I was referring to some time back, and we will come back to that later. From this section onwards, he indulges in a very interesting discussion on nationality, internationality, and transnationality. Okay, and it's important that we understand these concepts, beforehand, before going into the readings. So when you look at nationalism and internationalism, these were very specific modern constructs, because nation state is a product of modernity. Okay, nation state as the form of organization of governance is something very, very recent in its origin. So within the modernity framework, you have a group of nations coming together. Okay, so you have one nation, and then it has adjacent other nations. So you look at internationality as a scenario which is comprising of different nations coming together with very well bound, well-defined boundaries, or a very well-demarcated boundaries. So you see it as a agglomeration of well-defined boundaries with strong, very, very, very concrete kind of national boundaries. Okay, so when you talk about internationalism, we understand it's about the larger phenomenon of different nations coming together. Okay, without losing any significance. But whereas when you talk about transnationality, which is now becoming more important and relevant, we are not talking about internationalism, but we are talking about much more than that. Okay, so when you talk about transnationalism, when we are talking about transnationalism, we are talking about a scenario where the nation states are kind of they are transcended. They are transcended, and we are looking at the larger global flow of ideas, people, finance, technology, and a host of other things. So transnationality has more emphasis on the flow of ideas, people, and other things, and it gives less, or it has an understanding that the nation states are not as well-defined entities with very clear and impenetrable kind of boundaries. Okay, so here in transnationality as well, we understand the existence of nationality, but these nation states are not seen as very very, very important or rigid kind of entity. Rather, we understand that in a globalized world, a large-scale movement of people, movement of ideas, movement of finance, movement of technologies, okay, movement of trade is happening, which cuts across the nation states. So a perspective based on nationality and a perspective based on internationality is not sufficient when you talk about in the era of globalization. So that is exactly what Beck is explaining in this section. To understand he's talking about an anthropologist, Lucia Sheen. So to understand her analysis, we need to make a distinction between nation state and internationality. Nationality and internationality on the one hand, and transnationality and cosmopolitanism on the other. So nationality and internationality are not opposed to one another. On the contrary, they presuppose each other, because I mentioned that little bit back, that you can't have an internationality without the idea of a nation state as a very important entity, and internationalism is seen as a scenario of where you put all these nation states together. Okay, a single nation whose border and sovereignty are not recognized by others is just as inconceivable as a global nation state. On the other hand, transnationality and cosmopolitanism, on the other hand, undermines this system and presage a Copernican revolution in both political thinking and social theory. Let me explain what I mean briefly in terms of Kant. Kant believed that powerful cosmopolitan sentiments would emerge in 18th century Europe from the universalization of commerce and the dissemination of republican principle. When cosmopolitan sentiments became strong enough to cancel out the tendency of states to act as self-regulating and autonomous units, all individuals would be seen as though they were co-legislators in a single moral community. So this whole idea of cosmopolitanism and transnationality are coming together because you require that kind of an identification, not only with your nation state in which you are a part, but with a larger global understanding. So this is a general term for ways of life and responsibility that replace national either or with a multinational this as well as that. So as Beck mentioned and he gives quite a lot of illustrations and examples. I would urge you to read them. So is there a US Americanization of Asia and Europe? Is there also an Asiaization of the USA? Or at least can we examine how deterritorialization of Asian identity is changing the core of US identity? Now he comes back to this whole question of Americanization. Okay, is it true, or can we go by the argument that there is an Americanization, there is an influence of America is being extended, okay, uncritically, unopposed across the globe? Is it true, or is it something tenable? And Ulrich Beck is of very strong opinion that that is not tenable because first of all, what is happening within America itself is something very, very interesting. The very American identity or very American processes are no longer homogeneous or no longer singular. Okay, he talks about Asianization of America, of USA. For that matter, didn't the US Americanization of Europe grow out of Europeization of America? Okay, and the USA liberated Europe from Nazism. Did it Americanize Germany or Europeanize it? Isn't it America everywhere and therefore nowhere specific? And this is a very important argument. There are a lot of people who say that America belongs to everybody and America belongs to nobody. Okay, so it's always seen as a melting pot of cultures. It's always seen as a highly intermixed and diverse and heterogeneous community. So this argument about American culture invading other countries is something that Ulrich Beck does not kind of agree with. And he comes back to its whole idea of cosmopolitization. And so in order to explain, the second modernity is characterized by ways of life that scramble one-to-one correspondence that once existed between language, birthplace, citizenship, nationality and physical appearance. So this is something that we discussed extensively when we discussed Arjun Appadure, when he talks about the increasing disjuncture between these five scapes that he was talking about. Okay, so earlier in the modern society or even in the pre-modern society, you had all these things together: language, birthplace, citizenship, nationality and physical appearance. You could easily say that, okay, this population belongs to this particular region or this particular nation because their citizenship, their language, their political position, their identity, their everything, physical appearance, everything seems to be same. Now that is completely scrambled or unglued in the language of Arjun Appadure. So there are now pluralistic and multi-ethnic complexes combining elements that would formerly have been kept apart by national and cultural barriers. Indiscriminate mixing of national identity is no longer a nationalist nightmare or an utopian dream. Okay, so the mixing of national cultures or your native culture is being contaminated or polluted by other culture is no longer a big fear. Of course, it's a fear among different sections of people, but what we are seeing is the free flow of cultures and ideas and other things. This is the initial definition of cosmopolitanization. Inner globalization, globalization from within, the blurring through migration, telecommunication and transport of the foundations of nationhood. So this is an extremely important point that he talks about. What does cosmopolitization taking place? It's an inner globalization. Okay, a globalization that takes place within individual, within a nation state, within its own population community, because it gets exposed to, it begins to welcome other ideas, and in that sense turns out to be more open-minded, more cosmopolitan. Okay, there is an inner globalization, a globalization from within, the blurring through migration, telecommunication and transport of the foundations of nationhood. And there are at least two ways of conceptualizing globalization. At one hand, it is the David Held called interconnectedness. Okay, this view highlights the ways in which interdependencies, networks and flows are increasing in the modern world. That we know that they are talking about the kind of interconnectedness and then linkages and other things. And second term, or the other one, that cosmopolitization on the other hand which is my own tradition, highlights how far social structures and institutions are becoming transnationalized. Okay, so he's making this distinction very clear, the distinction between internationalization and transnationalization. The premise here is that the national is ceasing to be national. That's a very important point. He's not saying that the national is going to be going to disappear. It's not going to be irrelevant, but it is going to change its traditional roles. Once we take this point of view, we need a systematic discussion between national manifestation and cosmopolitan reality of global fluids, the flow of information, symbol, money, education, risk, and people. So globalization, in the sense, it's not only interconnectedness, it's not only about linkages, but it is about the fluidity of the contemporary times. Okay, the flows of people, the flow of technology, the flow of money, the flow of various equipments, commodities, fashions, consumption, culture, various cultural artifacts. So when you look at it as a highly fluid one, as a fluid state of being, this national or interconnectedness kind of a framework is not sufficient. Okay, so British sociologist Michael Billing has developed the concept of banal nationalism. He means that we are constantly and unconsciously defining and confirming our national identities as we engage in mundane activities. The opposite is true as well. We often experience what could be called banal cosmopolitanism. Banal in the sense it is there everywhere. It's there as a kind of an unconscious, unseen kind of a thing. It's there everywhere. Banal nationalism is being constantly eroded by this torrent of banal cosmopolitanism, and he gives a lot of examples about, say, how our TV shows are being inflected with quite a lot of ideas, tropes, and genres of programs from outside, how our reading habits, our films, our various forms of cultural consumptions are being extremely influenced by the global processes. This process of inner globalization is exemplified, perhaps most surprisingly, in military organization. He gives the example of NATO, and so please go through that. The main conclusion to be drawn from all these examples of banal cosmopolitanism is that the experiential space and horizon that distinguished first modernity, that of the national societies bounded off from one another, each distinguished by its own language, identity, and politics, are rapidly becoming a myth. Okay, this is something that we mentioned several times. Precisely those institutions that were thought to be best defined the nation are becoming progressively more transnational and cosmopolitan. That means that our most basic categories of understanding social world will have to be altered. So this is what he talks about as the need to move from methodological nationalism to methodological cosmopolitanism, because the very national institutions, the very nation state itself, the very national organizations themselves are becoming kind of a global. There is a kind of an inner globalization taking place from within. Society and politics are shedding their national form, even while the new organizational forms of cosmopolitical are still struggling to be born. From the ontological change must follow an epistemological change. Now, universalism and cosmopolitanism. The question that really distinguishes one doctrine from another is where they stand on the otherness of the other. Okay, so where do they stand on the otherness of the other? Because this otherness of the other is an inescapable reality. Okay, you can't change that. The other is always there. Now the whole question is, how do you deal with this other? How do you communicate with the other? How do you have a dialogue with the other? The answer seems simple. Cosmopolitanism affirms it. Okay, cosmopolitanism affirms the otherness of the other. It recognizes it, but it is open to that. And neoliberalism, globalization, and Americanization deny it. In fact, this simple answer will take a while to dissect. So, my thesis, which owes a lot to my reading of the post-colonialist, is that the production of knowledge about the other is a necessary preparation for an invariable accompaniment to colonial rule. Now, there is quite a lot of things, literature written about colonial rule, and we know that colonial rule was not only a rule aimed at economic exploitation, but it also was a cultural project. Okay, it was a cultural project. It had a cultural project. It emerged from the very strong conviction that the culture of the colonized is inferior to that of the colonizers. So that is why this whole process was justified on the basis of the white man's burden and other kind of arguments. So every concept of modernization implies traditionalism against which it can be measured. And every assertion that modernization is good entails a claim that traditionalism it replacing is worse. In this context, claiming that modern science and modern economics are value-free approaches to universally valid knowledge, while at the same time identifying these approaches with modern society amounts to elevating the assertions that traditional societies are inferior to an indisputable dogma. Okay, so this is something very interesting, because when we discuss notions of modernity in the coming lecture, it becomes very clear, because European Enlightenment had this very strong conviction that the modern that is going to be that is coming in to the place of tradition is far better ethically and morally. Okay, and it's also far better in terms of intellectually. In terms of its intellectual rigor. So what they argue was that this kind of a displacement of tradition is a positive thing. Displacement of tradition is positive thing, and they were extremely optimistic about the promise of reason. They were extremely optimistic about the promise of science. They were extremely optimistic about the promise of progress, the modern understanding of progress. So that kind of displays the tradition, and that kind of painted everything that is traditional as negative, as unworthy, as regressive, as something that needs to be eliminated. So that particular position of modernity is something that Ulrich Beck finds extremely problematic. A kind of an uncritical acceptance of modernist project. So this kind of elaboration, you need to go through that in between. There are two sorts of power at work here. At the first place, when universalism identifies difference with lesser value and similarity with equal value, history shows that it ends that in the end this is used to justify physical force. So when you, on the one hand, you have certain claims to universalism which are considered to be superior in terms of morally, ethically, and then intellectually, and when it comes up, when it encounters with more particularities of differences, then this has the tendency to kind of overcome the other through a kind of very by using physical force. In the second modernity, the missionary perspective that is still present in the concepts such as modernization and development policy makes a pedagogical goal out of justifying authority. In the second place, the missionary perspective that is still present in concepts such as modernization and development policy makes a pedagogical goal out of justifying authority. So this whole missionary perspective, the Christian missionaries, any religion for that matter which believes in proselytization, believes that the concept of God of these people are much inferior, and they really need to be saved. So there is a very strong self-righteousness in the part of these people who want to uplift this downtrodden people. So that kind of arguments, Beck says, will have to be tempered. It was a major characteristic feature of first modernity, which has not much of a relevance in the second modernity. So I began this section by saying that the core of cosmopolitanism is the recognition of the otherness of the other. I can now make this proposition more precise. It affirms both the Valladolid position rule out, that the other is both different and equal. Cosmopolitanism therefore sets itself against both racism and universalism. Cosmopolitanism is the struggle to keep this seemingly timeless racism from enduring into future. This includes making clear that the extent to which the ethnocentric universalism of the West is an anachronism that can be overcome. Okay, so now you must be knowing that there are quite a lot of discussion taking place about the ethnocentric character or Eurocentric character of European Enlightenment. Okay, all these important thinkers whom we discuss whether Marx that came, Weber or Kant or any of these of these Enlightenment thinkers were extremely Eurocentric. Okay, they were ethnocentric, and that specifically shaped the contours of European Enlightenment, and it also shaped the contours of a universalism that has scant regard or scant respect for differences and diversities and then different cultural kind of forms. So that he says is in the second modernity, that kind of arguments will have to be taken very cautiously. So to summarize internationality and transnationality, to summarize, the dualism that lies at the base of cosmopolitanism is conceived in very different ways by the competing conceptual schemes of internationality and transnationality. Between these two ways of thinking, a new kind of existence is taking place. The first modern world was a national world, which we discussed. There was a clear division between inner and outer, between domestic and foreign. That world, the nation state was a principle of order. Politics were national politics, culture was national culture, labor, class formation and class conflicts were all primarily features of the nation state. International politics was multiplication of nation states, each defining one another's borders and mirroring one another's essential categories. Okay? The reality of transnationality is quietly turning this entire structure of meanings inside out. When we examine the world from a transnational perspective, it is obvious that national and international are becoming harder and harder to distinguish. For example, terrorism. Okay? Global terrorism is no longer a national problem. Global warming is no longer a national problem. Or fight against pollution is no longer a national problem. The risk from nuclear armaments is no longer a national problem. And no nation will be able to resolve these things independently. A pandemic like COVID-19 is no longer a national problem. Okay? It requires kind of a transnational attempts and then serious engagements to control them. The defining parts of the nation are becoming denationalized. The national is becoming a zombie category, an example of a living dead. So we will also discuss Beck's very interesting arguments about the changing features of nation state. Very interesting argument. So the first modernity was national modernity. Second modernity is transnational or cosmopolitan modernity. This is a very important argument in which he kind of makes it in the nutshell. Second modernity is when society ceases to be a synonym for the nation state, and when all social development, economic, cultural, political and technology becomes first and fundamentally transnational. At this point, I should caution against a possible cosmopolitan fallacy. The fundamental fact that the experiential space of the individual no longer coincides with that of a nation might give the impression that we are all going to become cosmopolitans. However, cosmopolitization does not automatically produce cosmopolitan sentiments. This is a very important point that that he is talking about. A process of cosmopolitization need not result in the emergence of cosmopolitan sentiments or cosmopolitan values. In other words, if there is a serious backlash against some of the most globalized societies, it stands as the perfect example for this particular argument. These globalized societies, though they have become globalized, their economy has become globalized, they have been exposed to a whole lot of cultures and people and other things, that has not really produced cosmopolitan virtues or cosmopolitan sentiments. Many times there is a strong backlash against such an overexposure or exposure to globalization, and these people have gone back to a kind of a chauvinistic frame of mind, a kind of assertion of their own culture. They are no mood to accept the otherness of the other. Okay, so these two processes are very different. The process of cosmopolitization, many times forced one, is quite different from cosmopolitan virtues or cosmopolitan emotions or sentiments that we consider as kind of more welcoming or as kind of more virtuous. Okay, it can naturally give rise to opposite, the rebirth of ethnic nationalism, the rise of ugly citizen. which we see in the US or in different parts of the country, different parts of the nation, different parts of Europe, where there is a kind of an assertion about a kind of ultra-nationalism has emerged. This can happen at the same time as cultural horizons are expanding and sensitivity of lifestyle is growing. A very interesting, very contradictory kind of a process. Thus, the opposition between transnational and international is neither logically nor temporally exclusive. Okay? Instead, there is an uneasy coexistence between these two realities and the two ways of thinking. Furthermore, their combination is not a zero-sum game. So, rooted cosmopolitanism is defined against these two extremes of being at home everywhere and being home nowhere. It refers, as Roland Robertson and John Tomlinson argue, to an ethical localism, that is, to be engaged in the local and global at the same time. Okay? It is opposed to ethnocentrism but also universalism, whether from the left to the right. So, the problem with universalism is that it has a straitjacket understanding about how the world should work, and it has the wherewithal, it has the power, political power, economic authority to impose the straitjacket model to societies across the world, irrespective of, unmindful of the kind of violence that it might unleash. So, Beck is talking about a middle path, a kind of a rooted cosmopolitanism, where one is not, one is not ethnocentric, one is not, based on, one is not ready to open up their eyes and mind to outside, but it's also not a very rigid idea of universalism. Familiar with the violent realities that grow out of mutually exclusive certainties, it is suspicious that the false euphoria and the covert essentialism of multiculturalism. So this is again a very interesting point where he talks about the false euphoria and the covert essentialism of multiculturalism. When we talk about multicultural societies, for example, the UK, we understand that multiculturalism is seen as a amalgamation of different cultures. But there is a problem. The problem is that when you talk about multiculturalism, these cultures are being essentialized. Okay, and that creates quite a lot of problems for the individuals. It creates problems for everything. It provides quite a lot of false sense of essentialism to these kind of cultural categories and concepts and other things. So he concludes this essay with this kind of a cautionary notes that cosmopolitanization does not lead to cosmopolitan sentiments, and what you need to strike is a balance between a rooted cosmopolitanism, a cosmopolitanism with both roots as well as wings. And I think this really is a very remarkable, very important argument looking at the kind of changes that are happening in the global society. Because it's not that kind of a very rosy, glorious picture that many people fantasized, that the world is going to be a global village and people will become cosmopolitan and people will become world citizens. Okay, so that is not happening, and instead what we are witnessing is a series of backlashes, very strong backlashes against globalization, increased hate crimes, increased xenophobic crimes. So Beck is more realistic in that sense. So let us wind up the class here, and this is the final class for this week. In fact, 2 weeks of discussion on cultural globalization, and we will move ahead with the discussion on modernity and globalization for the next week. In fact, 2 weeks, because it's a central theme. Okay, so see you then. Thank you.